It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 124. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930. And in this episode, I'll be discussing a mixed styles bout between Henry Moses Dufur and Duncan C. Ross. And I'll also talk about catching up on WWE Raw and reviewing a Championship Wrestling from Florida show from 1982. So to start the show, I just wanted to give a quick update. I caught up on WWE over the past week. I had not watched Raw since the January 12th episode. So I had to watch January 12th through February 16th. Now, I'm not watching the entire show. I'm only watching the things that interest me and skipping over the things that don't. So it's not like that I had to watch whatever that would be, 10 hours, 12 hours of programming in 1 week. But I don't want to get that far behind on WWE or AEW anymore because it's quite painful to have to watch all of that at one time. My thoughts on WWE was I did not enjoy the Gunther versus AJ Styles match as much as I thought I would. And I think that's because I already knew the outcome. I knew AJ was going to retire after Royal Rumble. And knowing he was going to retire, you knew that he was going to lose the match to Gunther. And I didn't think he was going to beat Gunther on Raw either. And it was an okay match. But I didn't enjoy it nearly as much as I enjoyed the CM Punk versus Finn Balor match from Belfast, which was not only a great match, but it also had a real big event feel to it. A real hot crowd, which always helps the match. The one thing that I wanted to say earlier that I forgot was the one thing I did like is when AJ Styles lost at the Royal Rumble, he didn't tap out like John Cena did in his retirement match. He passed out, which is the way that a babyface should lose to a submission. So kudos for that. That was a good piece of creative. I'm not as excited about the CM Punk Finn Balor series after the Belfast match, even though the Belfast match was so good, because I don't know that they can recreate that atmosphere that they had in Belfast for that match. So it's more than likely going to be a disappointment. And then my final thought on WWE is I really had no interest in the Roman Reigns CM Punk match for WrestleMania. Roman Reigns won the Royal Rumble, and so he gets to pick his opponent. And it would make sense that he would pick CM Punk because they do have a lot of history with the connection to Paul Heyman, the matches that they had in the past as partners, and then the three-way match they had against Seth Rollins back in WrestleMania last year. The match does make sense on a number of fronts. I just wasn't all that interested in it until I listened to the promo that the two of them did on Raw. And probably the best promo I've heard in quite a while. And I think one of the things that made it so good is I think there is true tension between the two of them. I think that there are still people in WWE that resent Punk for leaving all those years ago. And even though it's probably in the past, I think that they were what the wrestlers used to call ribbing on the square in that promo, where they're bringing up things that really has irritated or rankled the other one about their opponent. And because they had some real friction or animosity in the past, maybe it's still there today, it just adds a little spice to that match and makes it more interesting. With all that being said, am I going to drop $30 to go see that WrestleMania? Absolutely not. As long as ESPN's price point is $30 a month, there is no way that I'm going to be becoming a subscriber to that ESPN add-on. I'm not going to support the corporate greed that goes behind that. And then I wanted to answer a question I got this week that really wasn't about combat sports history, but it was about what happened to a post from the website that was about St. Louis history. In 2020, when my job was eliminated from COVID and I was self-employed for 2.5 years, one of the things that I decided to focus the author business on was combat sports history. Prior to that, I had just written whatever struck my fancy on the website. And so I had probably 300 plus posts about St. Louis history. I had 300 posts plus about film studies. I had another 100 plus posts about family history. And then combat sports history altogether was probably 400 posts, maybe 100 posts between martial arts and boxing, and then another 150 posts on professional wrestling. There's a lot more now because since 2020, I've primarily focused on combat sports history, and that focus has primarily been professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930, when there were legitimate contests. Also, they worked the entire time as well. There's never been a time in professional wrestling that I've researched that there were not worked matches. So this person reached out to me about a St. Louis history post and asked what happened to them. And what happened to them is when I decided to focus on combat sports history in 2020, most of those posts I combined into books, published those, and only left about 100 of the posts that I thought were some of the better posts in that arena. I kept maybe maybe 60 film posts are still on the website, with maybe another 40 family history posts. And then combat sports history, which is a combination of boxing, bare knuckle prize fighting, and martial arts, maybe 100 posts there. And then the rest are the professional wrestling posts and the podcast. I'm not going to have this person go and buy the book. I'm just going to take that article that they were interested in and send them that. But if you were interested in those St. Louis history posts from the past or whatever, they're available. The St. Louis history ones are available in on Amazon in my St. Louis history book collection. The film posts, you just have to write to me because those are not published and they're not going to be published. I had a couple of film study books, but I unpublished them because they were never as popular as the history books, and I really wanted to focus on the history anyway. So jumping into the main content for this week, I picked a match from the book I'm currently working on about the 19th century professional wrestlers. And the reason I picked this match was, one, because the gentlemen in this match are working, and two, it showed how that they used a little spice, would add things to a match that they were working to make it interesting. Now, they're not Toots Mont, they're not coming up with those kind of angles yet, but they're doing little interesting things in this match that they're working to try to draw fan interest because they're planning on coming back the next month and working another match. So the two wrestlers involved in this match are Henry Moses Dufur, a very skilled collar and elbow professional wrestler, and Duncan C. Ross, who was a all-around great athlete and a pretty good catch-as-catch-can wrestler. And they're going to wrestle this match in Louisville, Kentucky in April of 1882. They're going to do a series of matches, one in April, one in May. I think the plan was to do 3, but they realized the series was running out of steam after the second match, and they just ended it there. So on Saturday, April 22nd, 1882, Dufur is going to wrestle Ross in a mixed styles match at the Masonic Temple in Louisville, Kentucky. So a mixed style match means they'll wrestle one fall according to collar and elbow wrestling rules, which was Dufur's specialty. They'll wrestle one fall according to catch as catch can wrestling, which is Ross's specialty. And then they'll wrestle one fall in another style, which I believe all their matches were pretty much side hold. So side hold is probably the style in the fifth fall. And by election, they end up selecting. Sorry for that brief interruption. My hand hit the wrong button and took me off of my notes on my phone. I think that's what the kids today call a first world problem. But the organizers had went about trying to select a referee, and they ended up selecting Major Edward Hughes, who was the chief of the Louisville Fire Department, to serve as the referee. And Hughes tried to refuse at first. However, the crowd prevailed upon him to take up the position of referee. So he consented to the will of the people, even though he really wasn't jumping at the chance to referee this match because he was afraid that, as an inexperienced referee, he could mess the match up. Hughes started the match between the gentlemen at 8:20 p.m. So Dufur won the coin toss and shocked everyone by choosing to wrestle the first fall of the best 3 out of 5 falls mixed style match according to catch as catch can wrestling rules. So this is the first little wrinkle they're going to throw in there. Ross specialized in catch as catch can wrestling, but Dufur was going to try to wrestle defensively and wear Ross out for the other falls. At least that's what they're going to tell everybody. But this was just one of those little interesting things to try to make the match a little bit more interesting for the fans. And the result of the first fall led observers to conclude that Dufur's gambit failed to pay off, which is what they wanted people to believe. After bringing Dufur onto the mat on Dufur's hands and knees with a hip and lift, Ross transitioned to an arm and neck lock, and then Ross used the lock to twist Dufur onto his back and shoulders. And the whole thing took him less than 5 minutes. So Dufur is going to use his defensive wrestling to wear Ross out, and Ross pins him within 5 minutes. So now Dufur is looking like he's not too sharp in the tactics he chose. But again, this is what they want the fans to believe. After a 10-minute rest, Dufur and Ross returned to the mat for the second fall, which is going to be contested under collar and elbow wrestling rules. And both men wore loose-fitting jackets for this fall. For a real quick reminder, collar and elbow wrestling was contested in jackets like for judo or for sambo. And so you had, one of the rules was you could not release the jacket. So they had to keep their grip on the collar and elbow the entire time. And a lot of the falls were gained by tripping the person or wheeling them over your hip, and like a hip throw from judo. Dufur applies a grapevine, which is his favorite hold, and starts to trip Ross, and he is able to put Ross on his back. Dufur's second jumped up and claimed the fall, and Dufur started walking back to the dressing room. However, Chief Hughes, the referee, and Ross's second talked for about 30 seconds, and Chief Hughes summoned Dufur back to the mat, and Hughes told him no fall, which infuriated Dufur because he said he hit his back when on the mat, but Hughes rightly said, according to the Edward James rules, Ross's back did not hit flat, so there was no fall. You couldn't roll someone onto their back. It would if they landed on their back, it would have to be part of the continuous movement. So say you threw the person, they landed on their side, and then you shoved them in the chest to their back. That usually was not going to be a fall because it was not one continuous motion. But if you tripped them and they fell hip and then rolled onto their back as just part of the continuous movement of that fall, then the fall would count. And Obviously, for a casual fan, this was not easy for people to see. This time, Dufur secures a hip lock and tosses Ross flat on his back to take the second fall after 2 minutes 30 seconds. And no one questioned the result of this fall. Again, they're working this match. I think the whole thing with Dufur leaving the mat and then being called back, this was all them working to just add a little spice to the match. So Dufur and Ross remove their jackets to start the third fall, which is going to be according to Catch Wrestling rules. And Dufur surprises Ross by lifting him up to start the fall and dumping Ross to his hands and knees. However, Ross reversed Dufur and put him to his back. Dufur bridged, but Ross broke down the bridge, pinning Dufur in 3 minutes. And Dufur had a very good bridge. A lot of times you could not bridge out of the pinfall in collar and elbow wrestling because it happened so quickly, but Dufur successfully used the bridge many times to prevent his opponent from pinning him in collar and elbow wrestling. So after the third fall, Dufur asked for a 20-minute rest, which Dufur said was allowed according to the Edward James rules of collar and elbow wrestling. However, Chief Hughes said that the men agreed to a 10-minute rest, so both men had 10 minutes to rest before the next fall. Dufur's looking aggravated. Again, we're working a little bit here to make the match a little bit more interesting. After the 10-minute rest, Dufur throws Ross with a hip lock in only 30 seconds to take the fourth fall. So now the match is tied at 2 falls apiece, so they're going to have to settle the match according to side hold wrestling rules. And in side hold, instead of jackets, they wore a harness. So after Chief Hughes secured the harness on both men, Dufur threw Ross over his hip and thought he had defeated Ross right at the start, but Hughes said no fall. Dufur again secured a hip lock and threw Ross flat to his back. This time it was a fall, and Dufur took the fifth fall and match in 2 minutes 15 seconds. Shock of shocks. When they come back to wrestle in May, in front of another big crowd in Louisville, and Chief Hughes is again chosen to be the referee based on his performance in this past match, Duncan C. Ross won that match and won the side hold fall in the fifth fall. Completely shocking result. The plan, of course, was for them to come back for a third match, the rubber match, the deciding match, but that didn't happen. And that would happen sometimes because either the fans cottoned on to the fact that they were working together to build up the series. The other thing was just inertia. When you put on these matches and you would do these series of matches in the same locale, people would start to get tired of them after a while. That's why in the territory days, they always talked about the blow off. You wanted to blow off the feud before the fans got tired of the two wrestlers going after each other. It wasn't all that different back in the 19th century, even when there were contests. The wrestling fans did not want to see the same wrestlers wrestling each other legitimately 7 times in a row. They would begin to lose interest. And while the crowd was really good for the April match, the crowd was still good for the May match, but attendance had fallen off a little bit. And they had known from years in professional wrestling, when the crowd fell off for the second one, usually the third one was really disappointing. If the crowd was the same size or a little bigger for the second match, then you had a good chance of drawing a decent crowd for the third match. But if the crowd was smaller for the second match, it was a lot of times a good idea to stop. And I'll give you an example from 1884. So J.H. McLaughlin and Henry Moses Dufur wrestled 3 collar and elbow matches in Detroit in 1884. The first 2 in the beginning of the year, the last one in October. The first match in Detroit drew 2,000 fans. That's an unheard of crowd in the 19th century. That's awesome. Anytime you can get a crowd into the thousands in the 19th century, you're doing a great job with your promotion. The second match had almost the same amount of people. They estimated there was between 1,900 and 2,000 people in the Detroit Opera House to see the rematch in March. So the first match was January 29th. The second match was Monday, March 3rd. The third match was in October, and it was October 10th. And that match drew 300 to 400 people. So by the time the third match had come around, they had completely lost interest. Now, part of that could have been McLaughlin won the first two matches, and they probably figured he's going to win the third match as well. But attendance was starting to drop off. The review for this week, I had promised to look at a Championship Wrestling from Florida show, and I picked the April 28th, 1982 television show for a couple of reasons. One, Eddie Graham was still alive and was still the main promoter, and while he always had a booker, Eddie Graham would also take an interest in what was going on, and he had final say in the promotion, and has always been considered a professional wrestling genius. So I wanted to get a television show from when he was more in his prime. I also picked the show because it was when David Von Erich was doing his heel run in Florida. So I wanted to look at a television show from when he was being a heel. And this was in preparation for a future NWA World title run for David Von Erich in St. Louis and in his main territory of World Class, where he wrestled for his father Fritz. David had only been a babyface, and it would have been very difficult to turn him heel in either World Class or St. Louis. So they sent him to Florida, where the fans really didn't know him that well, and he was apprenticed to Dory Funk Jr., which helped get him over as a heel in Florida. And on this particular show from April 28th of 1982, Barry Windham also returns to Florida for the first time since he'd been in Mid-Atlantic wrestling as Blackjack Mulligan Jr. So Barry Windham is the son of Blackjack Mulligan, who I believe's real name was Robert Windham, and Barry Windham is obviously Barry Windham. So Gordon Soley opens up the show, and Barbara Clary is part of the show, but Buddy Colt is not an announcer on this show. I don't know if he had stopped announcing by this point in time. I thought in some of the later shows in the late 80s, the mid 80s, he had been an announcer. So maybe he was on vacation for this particular show, but there's no Buddy Colt on commentary. And the show opens up with Barry Windham returning, and he takes on a local enhancement talent, probably by the name of Bob Russell. And Barry wins the enhancement match pretty quickly. And then the next segment, we cut to J.J. Dillon introducing his new signing, which is Jim Garvin. And this would be important in World Class because David Von Erich met Jim Garvin when they were both in Florida in 1982. And he brought Jimmy Garvin into Dallas in 1983 to do a program with David over the Texas Heavyweight Championship. And this helped build David because he had a young, good opponent to work with and really get himself over. Then Gordon Soley goes to a match. It's not a studio match, but it's a match from one of the house shows. And Chavo Guerrero is wrestling Hiro Matsuda. And after a back and forth match, Guerrero is able to defeat Hiro Matsuda with a sunset roll-up. After we see Guerrero defeat Matsuda, we come back to the studio where Chavo Guerrero is going to wrestle Kendo Nagasaki, who is Sakurada, not the English Kendo Nagasaki, but the Japanese wrestler who wrestled as Kendo Nagasaki. Chavo starts off hot with a bunch of drop kicks, and J.J. Dillon jumps up on the apron to distract Tommy Young in the middle of Chavo Guerrero's offense, and that gives Kendo Nagasaki a chance to hit Guerrero in the throat with this throat thrust that they're trying to get over. And the throat thrust causes Guerrero to bleed from the mouth, and eventually Mike Graham would come out and have to save Guerrero from this attack. And you could tell they're going to put Chavo Guerrero probably in a mid-card run here in Florida, but he's not going to get into the main events. And then you have a tag match, which is Mike Graham and B. Brian Blair versus Hiro Matsuda and Super Destroyer, which is some guy in a mask and singlet. I thought it might have been Gene Lewis based on the build, but Gene Lewis was in Central States at this time, not Florida. And so I think it's just some local guy that they put in a mask and a singlet. There was a neat little exchange between Graham and his wrestling trainer, Hiro Matsuda. Hiro Matsuda trained Mike Graham for professional wrestling. And they have a nice little back and forth wrestling exchange. But B. Brian Blair wins the match by rendering the Super Destroyer unconscious with the Cobra Clutch, which is a legitimate stranglehold. It's not used that way in professional wrestling, obviously, but Taz used it for years, calling it the Kata Hajime, which is the judo name for that particular hold. Then we get another tag team match, and we have Terry Allen, before he was Magnum TA in the Carolinas, taking on El Gran Apollo. Taking on. We have Terry Allen teaming with El Gran Apollo, and they are taking on Dory Funk Jr. and Derek Draper, who is Ed Wiskowski, the future Colonel de Beers. Why they had Ed Wiskowski wrestling as Derek Draper in Florida, I have no idea, but that's the name he was wrestling under. And this was a good competitive back and forth match. And Apollo shocked me. He kicked out of Dory Funk Jr.'s pile driver. Towards the end of the match, when they're going for the finish, Draper holds the top rope down and Terry Allen falls out of the ring. As he's trying to get back into the ring, Dory Funk Jr. suplexes Allen back into the ring and pins Allen for the win. So Terry Allen is not the star he would be once he went to Mid-South and to Mid-Atlantic Crockett Promotions. So then we cut to a match between David Von Erich and Sweet Brown Sugar. And the little clip shows how David Von Erich pinned Sweet Brown Sugar by putting his feet on the middle ropes to increase the leverage. And Sweet Brown Sugar protested this match to the NWA. So the NWA president, Jim Crockett Jr., who looks super young in this video, ordered a rematch in the future for the Florida TV title that David Von Erich held at the time. We get to the main event. And this was a match I was looking forward to because it's Hacksaw Butch Reed versus David Von Erich in the main event. Now, Butch Reed was on top in Florida, and he was getting ready for a match with Nature Boy Ric Flair for the world title. And this match was obviously going to be cut short. They used to have matches, TV time remaining, and when the TV time ran out, then most of the time the show would go off, you'd be in the middle of this match, which was going to happen here. But I was super interested in this match for a couple of reasons. One, Hacksaw Butch Reed is Bruce Reed from Warrensburg, Missouri, played college football there. He had a tryout with the Kansas City Chiefs, and he ended up wrestling in the Central States area. And because Sam Muchnick used a lot of the Central States talent to fill out his cards, we saw Bruce Reed when he was a rookie still wrestling under the name Bruce Reed. And he was an excellent, exceptional athlete. Really, in my mind, he could have and should have been the first black heavyweight champion in the NWA to hold the NWA title. But he went to Mid-South. He was a big star there. And I think the thing that hurt him was going to WWF and taking the money to be the natural Butch Reed for a year and a half, I think it was. But I don't think fans ever got it out of their mind about the big muscular guy walking around with bleach blonde hairdo, calling himself the natural. I think it was a gimmick that hurt him and continued to follow him around. David Von Erich, he was one of my two favorite wrestlers when I first started watching professional wrestling in St. Louis. My two favorite wrestlers were David Von Erich and Ted DiBiase. Now, Kevin started coming up a little bit more, and I got to see him, and I liked him. And I also became a big fan of Kerry. But my two favorites in the beginning when I started watching pro wrestling was David Von Erich and Ted DiBiase. So this was a match that I was really interested in seeing. And it wasn't bad. It was a TV match. They weren't going to do a whole lot. Butch Reed actually dominated most of the early part of the match. And then David took over as the time was starting to expire and was getting heat on Butch Reed. That is a match I would have loved to have seen in, like a Florida house show, because I think that would have been a really great match with two young wrestlers, not quite in their prime yet, but who could really go. So I'd recommend you check out the show. There'll be a link for this show in the show notes at KenZimmermanJr.com, episode 124. Almost forgot the number of the show. KenZimmermanJr.com/episode 124. KenZimmermanJr.com is also the website that I was talking about earlier with the post about combat sports history, St. Louis history, links to a bunch of the books I've written. If you're interested in digging more into this era of professional wrestling, you can check out KenZimmermanJr.com. I would also greatly appreciate it if you would rate this show wherever you listen to it. That helps keep the show visible and helps people who have not discovered it be able to find it. Next week, I'm going to look at, let me tell you what I'm going to look at. Let me look it up real quick. We're going to look at a boxer, a professional boxer who is wrestling, and he takes on a professional wrestler. And I've talked about Bob Fitzsimmons wrestling Joe Acton in the past, but this is actually Tom Sharkey, a heavyweight in the early 1900s, wrestling Sailor Joe Peening, who was a full-time professional wrestler in 1904, and this match will be from 1904. I'm also going to review the Smashing Machine, the biopic about Mark Kerr that starred The Rock. And I will catch everybody up on AEW. Because we're going to talk about the Smashing Machine, the next review of a wrestling card or wrestling show will probably be episode 126 after next week's episode. And with that, I think I will close the show. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.